Greetings, Acolyte, and welcome back to the Ordo Grigio, the Emperor's secret society against the enemy that is unpainted models. Today we rescue these abandoned firstborn Space Marines and return them to service for Loyalist Iron Warriors. These have been sitting around for a while, and I think have been with me for at least 3 house moves, and they've accumulated a fine layer of schmutz. So I start by blasting them with air through my airbrush. A can of compressed air would work, but I have an airbrush already. I think some of these were originally used for an Alpha Legion project or kill team, but some are missing pieces or have chaos parts on or full-on zombie bits. I set about removing any parts I didn't want with a combination of my clippers and a knife. I didn't have a full picture of them in my head at this point of what I wanted, but I knew I wanted some of the classic Mark III iron skull heads. So I removed any unhelmeted heads and a beaky head from the Sergeant model. I am appreciating the amount of extra ammo these missile launcher guys are carrying though, so kudos to whoever built these up in the first place. I separate them into 2 squads, a 6-man tactical squad with a sergeant and melter gun, and a 5-man Devastator squad armed with 4 missile launchers. This seemed the most practical division of the models I had, and the amount of heavy weapons seemed very Iron Warriors-y. One issue with removing the heads earlier is that some still had the neck piece in and needed it gouged out with a knife, along with some of the mould lines and other strange details I didn't want. I decided that each warrior should carry the Iron Warriors logo on their left shoulder, so I also removed those and were left with this. Time to awaken the machine spirit of my 3D printer for some conversion bits. An hour or 2 of printing and the Omnissiah has blessed us with all the bits we need to replace the missing parts of our models, and make them look like Iron Warriors. Some parts needed a little trimming of the model before they fit right, so I dry fit, trim, and repeat until I'm happy with all the fitments, and can start gluing parts together. Where I removed shoulder pads earlier left an awkward shape for the new pad to glue onto, but with some cuts and a tactical blob of glue, it was fine. It's actually quite hard to show the details on the parts I printed though, as they're messing with the auto exposure on the camera and are just blowing it out, but you'll see what they'll look like once some paint goes on the model. You can see all the different colours underneath the blue, and I wish I had stripped them back before I started painting them, as when I primed them black I was way too conservative with the paint, and there's still blue visible in the recesses, which I thought would look like a cool blue undertone, but I'm not so sure, so they might still get a repaint. Following the same scheme as with the Vindicator from last week, we start with Citadel's lead belcher for all the armour and metallics. As this colour goes on pretty much everything, I decided to just dry brush the whole model with it, to quickly add the metallics but still keep some of the black in the recesses. As it's the first step of the scheme and anything not metallic will be painted over, I just slap it on. I pick up paint with a brush, smush it on my workstation, even though I have a palette right next to me, and flick it over the model, catching more paint on the raised surfaces of the model. I repeat this step on all 11 models before moving on to the next step. Sandy dust comes out, thinned as always with a bit of water, to block in all the details that will be beige or hazard striping. This is all the purity seals, pouches, some weapon casings such as the Power Fist, which won't come back to bite me at all. I also decided that the Tactical Marines would have their left knee pad as hazard stripes, and the Devastators would have their right. Though with a mishmash of variants in the armour, if they didn't have a knee pad, I applied it to the elbow pad instead. As I moved through each model, I chose individually where to add any extra hazard stripe areas to give each model a bit more individuality but still feel cohesive on the tabletop. Mephiston Red next for all the marine eye lenses and sights, as well as the wax seals on the purity seals. This adds a bit of colour to the model, but using it for both helps keep the total number of paints to a minimum. I also apply this to any weapon cables such as the one on the melter or the missile launchers, as well as to the tips of the missiles. It was a bit fiddly to get into some of the eye lenses of the models, especially the Sergeant's iron mask, but any mistakes at this point can just be cleaned up with a touch of lead belcher. Also, this guy might be my favourite tactical marine. There's something very Iron Warriors about having a lasgun as a backup weapon. With the red done, they look like this. Next is leather brown from Army Painter. I used this to weather the tracks of the Vindicator to add mud, so what better way of doing their bases than the churned up mud of a marshy battlefield. This gets thinned with water and applied over the base. As these are all rescue minis, they have a variety of different basing mediums. Some look like Games Workshop gravel from years ago, some look like just sawdust and superglue, and at least 2 had astrogranite from Citadel applied as their base was blank when I started building them. Despite the different textures, they all got the same treatment, and once the base was covered, I went over parts of the boot and shin plates of the model to add in brown where the mud would splash up or cover their armour, much like we did on the Vindicator. As with weathering the tank, it's a sort of feel thing here, so I just added more until I was happy, and then moved on to the next model. Rakarth Flesh, a favourite on the channel, comes back out for painting all the cloth on the models, purity seals, tabards, pouches, banners. I layer this on, leaving just a little bit of the Zandri dust in the recesses to add a bit of depth to the models, which will be enhanced later on. Originally I had considered painting the pouches a more traditional leathery colour, but I chose the cloth colour as I thought it would be reminiscent of Hessian sandbags, which are fairly Iron Warriors-esque. What better way to use a sandbag when it's not full of sand than to carry your bolter ammo into battle? Plus it's a lot quicker and easier to replace a cloth pouch than to cure leather. I imagine with the battles of attrition they face, their equipment is geared more towards easy replacement rather than longevity, as even hardware and pouches would be shredded fairly quick. Matte Black from Army Painter next, starting with all the weapon casings of the models. And ignoring the random headless Chaos Iron Warrior in the background, you didn't see him, that's a different timeline. In the original 3rd edition Iron Warriors that got me hooked, I always saw them with black weapon casings and shoulder pads, so I do that with these guys. The paint is thinned well, but still has enough coverage that one coat is enough to remove the metallic colour and leave a flat black to contrast the metallic sheen. I also apply this to the lasgun carried by the backup marine. Then it's time. Hazard stripes. A lot of you left good comments on the Vindicator video about masking lines off and using pencils to enhance my freehand. However, I still don't have tape and realised I didn't have a pencil either. I got impatient and didn't want to wait for Amazon to deliver them. So to make it a bit easier for myself, I tried to do the stripes about a brush width wide. It's a totally different experience doing them on the smaller infantry models than on the tank, so I just kind of winged it. The pole fist on the Sergeant was probably the biggest pain in the backside, as the chevrons would be going in 2 different directions. And I totally screwed it up the first time and ended up with most of it black. I did end up coming back in once all the black was applied and using the Zandri dust to re-establish the stripes and clean up a lot of the lines. It'll look fine in the end, honest. Demonic Yellow from Army Painter next, after cleaning up mistakes, to add a highlight and bring some vibrancy to the hazard stripes. This is thinned quite a bit and I try to leave some of the Zandri dust of each line showing, on rounded parts such as the knee pads, and try and focus more on the upper portions of the shape. You can see the tidying up I did on the Power Fist here as I go to apply the yellow highlight. And with the yellow one I'm actually getting a little bit happy with these models, which is rare for me if I'm honest. It comes with a hint of sadness though, and a little bit of nostalgia, as Iron Warriors were always a favourite of mine when I first got into 40k, but the hazard striping put me off. I didn't have the confidence to tackle it, and thought I'd ruin the models. But after giving it a go on the Vindicator and now the infantry squads, I wish I did it all those years ago. I guess the lesson here is, if you have a cool idea, give it a go, rather than giving in to the little voice that says it won't be any good. I missed out on years of having an army like this because I gave in to that voice, and it's not like I'm much of a better painter now than I was then, so the end result would have been around the same. Not perfect, but totally adequate for the tabletop. Also yes, that Sergeant is dual wielding a Stormbolter and a Bolter. Sue me. With the striping done, they look like this. For the brass details, Retributor armour comes out to play. Applying this to the details such as belts, aquillas, skulls, and shoulder pad trim moves them from being health and safety conscious wannabe Iron Hands into full-blown Loyalist Iron Warriors, and really solidifies the scheme in my head, even if it's a bit fiddly at times and a little nerve-wracking, as everything else around these details is already painted how it should be at this stage. Though at least it's mostly lead belcher with these guys and not a layered and blended cape that took you 4 hours, not that I've done that. And that's why I'm using the same brush I used for the hazard stripes, and I think that might be one of the best skills you develop over time painting, knowing how big a brush you can get away with when painting details like this. With the base colours down, more lead belcher is used to begin the weathering process. As with the Vindicator, the hazard stripes get a stipply, dry brushy technique, as well as any areas where the model is damaged, like flash from the shoulder pad being removed from the sprue, which is now battle damage. As happy as I am with my attempt at hazard stripes, they would look wrong next to the Vindicator if they weren't as worn, so each model gets a quick going over, adding this across any part I feel needs it. Not enough that you can't see the hazard stripes at all, not after spending so long on them. Following the theme of previously used paints, leather brown comes out for a stipple onto areas I want to pick out for rust and corrosion, just like the Vindicator. It's almost like I'm following the paint scheme I did last week on a tank, because they're for the same army I thought about doing in a campaign, then gave up on it, got bored, and now I have an entire starting force minus a commander. Nah, bad decisions. By varying how much paint is on my brush while I stipple, I make some of the areas of corrosion more apparent, and this adds some diversity to the areas to disrupt how uniform they are looking, and I also make sure to add this to any areas I've done with battle damage to imply that battle damage has been there for a while. Wild Rider Red comes out for another lighter round of stippling on the battle damage. Using an orange adds more texture to the rust and gives an impression of fresher patches of rust, which haven't dulled down quite yet. Their armour may be damaged, but it will still protect them from the enemies of the Imperium. The orange also helps distinguish the areas of rust from the muddy weathering on the boots, and will stop the armour looking just dirty in places it should be damaged, leaving the unit looking like this, which is not bad, but missing the last few steps. Agrax Earthshade is applied over the entire model, in some places quite generously. This will tone the silver down, add warmth to the brass, and shading across the entire model. Washes are a great easy way to add depth or to tint miniatures, and using a brown wash all over on a model with a muddy, marshy environment base will also help tie them into their surroundings. I tried to work it into the recesses to hide and tone down the blue that was still there on some models, however in the final models it can still be seen and doesn't look as good as I had hoped. Once all the models have been washed and dried, we can move on. A 50-50 mix of dark wood and gloss varnish is used for the model's base. I like the mix of a speed paint and a gloss varnish, as the colour still settles into the recesses to add depth, but it retains the shine of a gloss to give it a wet appearance. I first used this technique for a blood effect on my Space Wolf Berserkers. Once the base texture has been painted, I bring the colour up onto the boots and the areas we painted leather brown earlier, though I make sure to leave some of the brown showing where the mud has begun to dry around the edges. Once that's dry, we're left with this. So there we are, 2 squads of firstborn, Loyalist Iron Warriors, dredging through the muddy battlefields of the 41st millennium to besiege the fortifications of their enemies. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions for future videos, I'd love to hear them down in the comment section below. And I'll see you all next time.